national independence. I think it is very important that there be a discussion on this very important event because for a very long time, many people take this for granted, and to a very large extent, I believe that it's important that everyone who is a citizen in this country begins to take our celebrations very seriously because of what they mean to our nationhood. Let me start by saying that national independence is of critical importance because if you go back to our history, I'm thinking about the period long before independence when the white colonial system or the white settler system conquered and colonized Zimbabwe. The effects of all that is what is critical to understand. I believe that to a very large extent, what happened is that the white people came here with a very clear mind to overcome the indigenous people of this country and take this land for themselves. But just taking it in a physical sense was not enough. It was very important that they deal with the mind of the African peasant. They went about very systematically because when they arrived in this country over a century ago, there's quite a number of things that they did. The first one was to make sure that the African person was deculturalized. In other words, they introduced the systems that rendered our culture almost irrelevant. They also introduced systems that disempowered us economically. I want to believe they also introduced an education system that killed the African mind, the African sense of self, the African dignity. That whole process was very dehumanizing. To a very large extent, it undignified the African person. Thereafter, it was a series of very devastating actions that left the Africans marginalized, impoverished, and almost deprived of a true and genuine memory of who they were. Over nearly 100 years, the white person changed our perception of self. They changed our way of life. They changed even our thought processes to the extent that today it's not surprising that a lot of people live in denial of self. They exalt things that are foreign to themselves. They obviously think that anything that is an African is better. And this is a very dangerous trend. And I think it's got to be arrested before a lot more damage is done. What happened after the white men took over? Our forefathers reacted. We talk about heroes of the first Chimbrenga. They reacted to this. And a lot of them resisted, the colonial system, and you know what happened. They died. Years later, our nationalists, called them the nationalist movement, that had great leaders, some of whom obviously went to prison, were incarcerated, were to a very large extent undignified because of the way they were treated. That resistance led at some point to a decision that the only way that we're going to deal with the white settler system was to confront it militarily, something that was done. And the war was brutal. We were fighting clearly because then we wanted to be absolutely sure that we could go back to our roots, we could go back to our way of life, we could go back where we recover our land and re-establish ourselves as a people once again. And I'll tell you what, that was not a walk in the park. It was extremely difficult. A lot of young people made decisions to go out there and fight very brutally and seriously. And this is what led to the independence in 1980. And 42 years on, what are we seeing on the ground? Very often, a lot of people have a serious misunderstanding of the National Day. There are people who've organized themselves into political outfits. There are people that came here many years ago through no fault of their own. They're not necessarily indigenous people. All these people hardly participate in our National Day. The day is very significant because it signifies the return of potentially, of course, of everything that's African. We may forgive those that have no African tradition and origin, but quite frankly, once they've been assimilated into the African space, which is an independent Zimbabwe, we expect everyone to take pride on that day, take it seriously, participate in all the events. Because short of that, what does it mean? It means if we don't take this seriously, our national sovereignty is threatened, the state security is threatened, the dignity of this nation is under threat, and we can't have that. We also have a situation where we should resist any attempt to be persuaded not to recognize this day by people who obviously have intentions to reshape, reconfigure, redefine our nature as a people. They tried that over 100 years, and we lost, obviously, a lot of what we were. But it's time since 1980 that efforts be made to bring us back to where we were before the colonial system. The area that is very important is to safeguard ourselves from infiltration by people who essentially are serving the imperial system. There's a lot of groups in this country that oppose government for the sake of it. They don't offer anything very productive, nothing that's very useful to the citizens of the country. The idea is they must ensure that the status quo as desired by the imperial system is sustained. And we always talk about regime change because these people have been put together to ensure they frustrate everything that we've been doing as African people in this country. I really want to appeal to citizens to understand that with only one country, if we support that country, if we get out there to take opportunities of what we are offered by government, all of us work very hard to ensure that our nation succeeds, we will owe it to ourselves to have a very successful Zimbabwe. What we're asking for is for our space to think for ourselves, to organize ourselves, free of interference from these very dangerous international forces that keep on frustrating the growth of Africa. It's more like they are creating conditions that leave most of our countries, Zimbabwe being one of them, so much very fragile because we are then not given the space to act independently and freely. When we've taken our interests into account, there's always some kind of backlash. I mean, okay, Zimbabwe has not had the same experience as other countries, but we know Saddam Hussein was killed for more or less the same thing, Gaddafi and so on. Somalia was destabilized, the DRC continues to be destabilized and so on. There are attempts at all times to make sure that when we are about to take off, something must always happen to hold us back. And this is why I said in my initial comments that it's going to be very important that independence should mean independent thinking, independent actions, self-determination, and the power of all the nations to look at themselves, size up their situation, decide what they want to do, and do so freely, and they be free to trade with other nations without restrictions. most of the problems that we are facing today are manufactured. Because they are manufactured, it's important that we be left that space to deal with our situation the best way we see. And I think that if the policies that government is coming up with in relation to young people, the mainstream society, and women, I am totally convinced that we'll be much closer to resolving most of the challenges that we face. Yes, the future belongs to the youth, and it is in their interest to take a cue from what government is doing and play their part in celebrating what they have already in their pocket, which is the strength of our sovereignty, our national security, our national cohesion, our national unity, and of course the peaceful conditions that exist in this country. You need those in order to go forward, and I would imagine that all young people appreciate that and begin to embrace that and move together with the government to create a future that addresses their needs very successfully.